Ask anyone on the planet to name the world's best-run city, and Singapore comes up within the first 3 answers. The data supports it. The skyline confirms it. 40 years of uninterrupted growth, a GDP per capita that rivals Switzerland, a Changi airport that makes the rest of the world's infrastructure look embarrassed, and a government so competent it has become a case study in every serious school of economics and public policy on Earth. This is, by every standard metric, a machine that works. But here is what the metrics do not show you. The machine has been running on a fuel source that is quietly, mathematically, and almost silently running out. Not because of an external shock, not because of a war or a financial crisis or a geopolitical miscalculation. Because the very design that made Singapore extraordinary, the ultra-disciplined sacrifice everything, meritocracy or die social contract, has now begun to crack from the inside. 5 distinct fractures. Each one is manageable in isolation. Together they form a structural failure that no sovereign wealth fund can simply write a check to fix. Most people watching the skyline are still admiring the glass, so the question I want to put to you right now before we go any further is this. If the miracle was always built on a timer, at what point does the clock become impossible to ignore? Singapore did not grow, it was engineered. Every square kilometre of its 733 square kilometres was treated as a strategic asset, every citizen as a unit of productive output, every policy as a variable to be optimised by technocrats who genuinely believed that discipline applied at the national scale could override geography, history and natural resource poverty. For 4 decades, they were right. The island imported cheap labour by the millions, built factories, then financial institutions, then one of the most sophisticated logistics networks the world had ever seen. It went from third world to first world inside a single generation, and the world watched in stunned, slightly envious silence. But every trajectory has a ceiling, and Singapore has been pressing against its own for longer than its government is comfortable admitting. The land ran out first. There is no agricultural hinterland to absorb expansion, no frontier to push into. Reclamation projects have added territory at the margins, but the costs are exponentially higher than they were 30 years ago, and the returns are diminishing. The cheap regional labour that built the island's foundational industries priced itself out of the equation as Malaysia and Indonesia developed their own domestic consumption stories. The easy manufacturing winds migrated to Vietnam, to Bangladesh, to any country willing to sell labour cheaply. What remained was a high-cost, high-skill economy squeezed onto a very small island, telling itself that innovation and financial services would carry the weight that land and cheap labour once did. That bet has not yet fully failed, but the odds are quietly shifting. The Housing Development Board was one of the most genuinely brilliant pieces of social engineering of the 20th century. In 1960, the vast majority of Singaporeans lived in overcrowded slums. Within 30 years, over 80% of the population lived in government-built flats, owned outright, with access to subsidised mortgages drawn from their own mandatory savings. Home ownership rates that Western democracies could only dream of. A population with skin in the game, quite literally. Stability as architecture. Here is where the story gets complicated. Those flats are built on land leased from the state for 99 years. Not sold, leased, and they are no longer cheap. In 2023, resale HDB flats, the supposedly affordable backbone of Singaporean housing, began breaching the $1 million threshold with regularity. Not in prime districts, in Toa Payoh, in Woodlands, in towns that were built specifically to house the working and middle classes. A 5-room flat in a mature estate, the kind of property a government designed for nurses and civil servants and bus drivers, now requires a household income and a mortgage commitment that would have been unthinkable to the generation that first moved in. The government frames this as an asset appreciation story. Your flat is worth more, you are wealthier on paper, but a family trying to enter the market for the first time does not experience appreciation, they experience exclusion. The system that was designed to give every Singaporean a stake in the economy is now pricing a generation out of the first rung of the ladder it was built to provide. That is not a housing success story. That is a housing system eating its own founding promise. And here is the part no government report will put on the front page. Those million-dollar flats are not actually yours. They never were, and the clock on them is already running. A 99-year lease sounds like ownership. It is designed to feel like ownership. You receive keys, you paint the walls, you sell it to someone else for a profit. For one generation, perhaps two, the distinction between a lease and freehold property is largely academic. But the mathematics of depreciation do not care about feelings, and they do not negotiate. As a leasehold flat ages, its value does not simply plateau. It begins to decline. The closer a property gets to the end of its lease, the harder it becomes to sell, and the harder it becomes to finance. Banks become reluctant to extend mortgages on aging leasehold properties. The resale market thins. A flat that was worth $1 million at 50 years of remaining lease becomes worth a fraction of that at 20 years. The asset that an entire family spent 30 years paying off through their CPF contributions quietly hollows itself out from the inside. Singapore has a voluntary scheme, the Selective en bloc redevelopment scheme, through which the state can buy back aging estates and redevelop them. It is presented as a safety net. In practice, it is selective by definition. It is not guaranteed, and it applies to a tiny fraction of the housing stock. The government has been notably careful not to make any binding commitments about what happens when the lease clock runs to zero on the hundreds of thousands of flats now deep into their tenure. The wealth that Singaporeans believe they are sitting on is, for a significant portion of the population, a number on a screen attached to an asset that the state will repossess in their children's lifetime. That is not a pension. That is a very expensive rental agreement with a government that controls both the land and the rules. Every economy runs on people. Specifically, it runs on the ratio between people who are working and people who are not. When that ratio is healthy, tax revenues are strong, healthcare systems are solvent, pension funds are funded, and governments can make promises about the future with some reasonable confidence that the money will be there to keep them. When that ratio inverts, everything downstream of it begins to strain simultaneously. Singapore's ratio is inverting. The island's total fertility rate currently sits at approximately 1.0. The replacement level required to maintain a stable population without immigration is 2.1. Singapore is not at 1.8 or 1.5, numbers that would represent a challenge. It is at 1.0. That means, in the absence of immigration, each generation is roughly half the size of the one before it. The government has offered baby bonuses, extended parental leave, subsidised childcare, and public campaigns that veer between heartfelt and desperate. None of it has moved the needle in any sustained or meaningful direction. Young Singaporeans are not refusing to have children out of selfishness. They are doing the maths. The cost of housing, the cost of education, the ferocity of competition, and the cultural expectation that both parents must maintain full-time careers to sustain a basic standard of living. All of it adds up to a rational decision that a second child is a financial risk a household simply cannot absorb. The fertility collapse is not a cultural failure. It is a structural verdict delivered by an entire generation of people who have read the fine print and decided the terms are unacceptable. If this video is landing differently than you expected, that is the point. Hit the like button and subscribe. There are 5 more cracks in this foundation, and the next 2 are the ones the government is least willing to talk about. Because while Singapore is running out of citizens willing to have children, it has been quietly importing a solution that has created an entirely different crisis of its own. Singapore's workforce is approximately 40% foreign. That number is not a secret. It is published, but the full weight of what it means rarely gets discussed with the honesty it deserves. The island has been dependent on imported labour at every level of the economic stack, from the migrant construction workers who build its skyline while living in dormitories at the edge of the city, to the foreign professionals who fill senior roles in finance, technology, and pharmaceuticals that the local population cannot fill at the volume required. The official position is that this is complementary. Foreign workers do the jobs Singaporeans will not do, or cannot do, at the scale the economy requires. The labour market is managed through a tiered pass system designed to protect Singaporean workers at each skill level. In theory, this creates a clean hierarchy. In practice, the mechanics of wage suppression are messier than any official framework acknowledges. When the supply of willing qualified workers is structurally augmented by hundreds of thousands of foreign nationals, who accept lower wages and fewer protections because their residency is tied directly to their employment, the bargaining power of local workers in the same sector is quietly eroded. Not through conspiracy, through arithmetic. And then there is the question of identity. A city where 4 in 10 workers hold foreign passports, and where the cultural composition of entire residential and commercial districts shifts visibly within a decade, does not experience that as a statistic. It experiences it as texture, as language, as the gradual sense that the place is changing faster than the people who grew up in it can process. The Central Provident Fund is regularly cited as one of the most successful mandatory saving systems ever designed. Every working Singaporean contributes a percentage of their salary into personal CPF accounts, matched by employer contributions invested and accumulated over a working life. By the time a Singaporean reaches retirement age, the numbers in their account can look genuinely impressive. Hundreds of thousands of dollars, sometimes more. The numbers, however, require context. The CPF is not a simple savings account. It is a highly structured system that ring-fences funds for specific uses. The ordinary account, the special account, and the MedSave account each have rules about what the money can and cannot be used for. A significant portion of CPF contributions is consumed by housing payments over the course of a working life, the same leasehold flats discussed earlier. By retirement, many Singaporeans discover that the gross figure in their CPF statement bears limited resemblance to the liquid, accessible income they can actually draw on. The CPF life annuity scheme, which converts retirement savings into a monthly payout, currently delivers roughly 1,500 to 2,000 Singapore dollars per month at its basic tier for a retiree who has contributed consistently. In a city where a one-bedroom apartment in a non-prime area rents for over $2,000, where healthcare costs for the elderly are rising at a pace, and where inflation has permanently restructured the cost of basic goods, that monthly payout does not constitute retirement. It constitutes managed insufficiency. It is the reason Singapore has one of the highest elderly workforce participation rates among developed economies. Not because its seniors are uniquely vital and engaged. Stopping work is not financially survivable for a very large number of them, but the retirement trap is not only a financial problem, it is a symptom of something deeper, a society running at maximum output year after year, with no permission to slow down, eventually breaks something that no provident fund can repair. Singapore's education system consistently tops the global PISA rankings. Its students outperform virtually every country on earth in mathematics, science, and reading comprehension. This is presented as evidence of a rigorous, high-functioning society that takes the cultivation of human capital seriously. What it also represents is a childhood structured almost entirely around competitive examination performance from the age of 6, a process that filters, grades, and streams children into academic hierarchies so early and so definitively that the psychological weight of a single primary school test can determine the trajectory of an entire family's social standing. The pressure does not lift after school. It migrates into the workplace, where Singapore's average working hours consistently rank among the longest in the developed world, where a culture of presenteeism and performance visibility means that leaving the office on time carries genuine professional risk, and where the social contract asks each citizen to produce at full capacity in exchange for the stability and infrastructure the state provides. The consequence is visible in the data. Mental health issues among young Singaporeans have been rising steadily for a decade. Surveys of educated young professionals consistently show high rates of disengagement, a desire to emigrate, and a deep ambivalence about whether the rewards of Singaporean productivity are proportionate to the cost of producing them. Brain drain is still modest in absolute terms, but the direction of travel is concerning. When the most mobile, most educated, most globally competitive citizens of a small island begin to ask whether life is better somewhere with lower ceilings, but more room to breathe, the question itself is a structural signal worth taking seriously. Every serious conversation about Singapore's economic future circles back to the same solution: innovation. The pivot from an economy built on trade, logistics, and financial intermediation toward one that generates original intellectual property, that builds globally dominant technology companies, and that exports ideas rather than services. The government has committed billions to this transition. The research infrastructure is world-class. The universities produce genuinely talented graduates. The ambition is sincere. The problem is cultural, and it runs deep. Innovation at the frontier requires an acceptance of failure that is structurally incompatible with the society Singapore has built. Venture creation demands risk tolerance, unconventional thinking, a willingness to defy the consensus and absorb public failure before eventually finding the thing that works. These traits are not randomly distributed. They are cultivated in environments where failure carries some cost but not a catastrophic one, where hierarchy is questioned rather than deferred to, and where there is enough economic slack that a talented person can afford to try something that might not work. Singapore has produced excellent engineers, excellent analysts, and excellent operators. It has produced very few founders of global significance. The country with the educational rigor of Singapore and the regulatory efficiency of Singapore has not yet produced its Google, its Samsung, its Alibaba. The region has watched Indonesia and India generate tech ecosystems of far greater creative velocity, built on messier, less disciplined foundations that somehow left more room for genuine experimentation. You cannot educate a generation to optimize for the correct answer on a standardized test, and then expect that same generation to build companies that succeed by asking questions nobody has thought to ask before. The two imperatives are in direct conflict, and Singapore has not yet found a way to reconcile them. The mathematics of Singapore's demographic future are not projections built on contested assumptions. They are arithmetic built on people who have already been born, or more precisely on the people who have not. The working-age population that will be asked to support a rapidly expanding cohort of elderly citizens in 2040 is already in school today. There is no policy intervention, no immigration program, no fertility incentive that can meaningfully alter the ratio over a 15-year horizon. The wall is not approaching. It is already visible from here. By 2030, roughly 1 in 4 Singaporeans will be over 65. The support ratio, the number of working adults for every retiree, will compress from its current level toward numbers that make the CPF's long-term solvency a genuine question, rather than a settled one. Healthcare spending will increase structurally. The state will face a binary choice that no technocrat in the Singaporean tradition enjoys confronting: raise taxes on a productive workforce that is already exhausted, or reduce the quality of public services that the entire social contract was built around delivering. Neither option is painless. Neither preserves the model intact. What Singapore faces is not a collapse. The institutions are too strong, the reserves too deep, the governance too competent for an overnight unravelling. What it faces is something more insidious, a long-managed deceleration in which the miracle gradually becomes the maintenance economy. The extraordinary gradually becomes the merely adequate, and a generation of Singaporeans finds that the sacrifices their parents made to build the machine are being asked of them too, but with a fraction of the upside their parents received. The clock has been running since the first lease was signed. The question is no longer whether the model has a limit. The question is whether enough people are willing to see it before the limit finds them.